Nurse Kitty to the pit. That was what Dr. Richard Ashford called her when the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and nobody important was listening. He didn't know. Nobody at Oak Creek Memorial knew. They saw a probationary nurse who kept her head down during shift changes, arriving at 0500 with her badge clipped low and her eyes on the work in front of her. They didn't know about the shrapnel still lodged near her spine, pressing against bone like a permanent clock ticking countdown to pain. They didn't know the woman restocking the crash cart with machine gun precision had once performed field thoracotomy with a combat knife in a sandstorm 70 miles from any hospital. What happened next brought a general through the trauma bay doors, and everything Katie Morrison had buried for 2 years came roaring back to life. The ICU at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like antiseptic cut with something metallic, something that lived under fluorescent lights and never quite left. Katie Morrison pushed her crash cart through the pneumatic doors at 0507 on a Thursday morning, moving with the kind of efficiency that made newer nurses stop and watch without knowing why. She wasn't fast. She was precise. Every foredrip organized by gauge size. Every medication aligned. Every corner of the cart positioned so a gloved hand could find what it needed in darkness. Muscle memory wasn't something she thought about anymore. It was something she lived inside of, like her own skin. 2 years at Oak Creek. 2 years of keeping her head lower than her competence demanded. 2 years of letting colleagues assume the quiet woman in the ICU was exactly what she appeared to be, another nurse rebuilding her life after some generic personal tragedy, the kind nobody asked about. The ones who did ask received a smile that closed like a door. The ones who didn't learn not to look too closely at the way her hands moved, or how she calculated medication dosages faster than the pharmacy computer, or how she seemed to anticipate patient crashes before the monitors even whispered their first alarm. Dr. Richard Ashford had been watching her for 6 months. He was the hospital's chief of surgery, the kind of man who wore Italian loafers with his lab coat and spoke in the tone of someone accustomed to being right about everything. His office sat on the 4th floor with a view of the parking lot, a position he'd held for 9 years, the kind of tenure that made him dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. He noted the way Katie never joined the gossip circles by the nurses' station. He noted that she'd never mentioned her background, her family, where she came from before Jacksonville. He noted that she wore scrubs 2 sizes too loose and had a barely perceptible limp favoring her left side, as if her body held a secret it wouldn't share. What Ashford didn't know was that the limb favored the side where surgeons had extracted shrapnel from a blast radius in Helmand Province, leaving fragments too close to her spinal cord to remove safely. What he didn't know was that the scrubs hung loose because she'd learned to move differently, to think differently, to carry herself differently than the woman she'd been 5 years ago. What he didn't know was that the quiet competence he observed wasn't dedication to nursing. It was the discipline of someone who had held bleeding soldiers in her hands and learned that every second mattered. The supply room on the ICU corridor had 4 cameras and 0 witnesses at 0213 on a Tuesday morning. Katie had come in early, as she did most days, to organize and restock before the shift properly began. The room smelled like plastic and pharmaceutical cold, everything sealed, everything accounted for, everything catalogued in the system that hung on the wall like a jury watching every transaction. Dr. Ashford was already there when she pushed open the door. He stood with his back to her, his white coat hanging open, one hand moving with the casual grace of someone accessing items they accessed regularly. 3 pre-filled fentanyl syringes disappeared into his lab coat pocket with the practiced ease of a magic trick. He was still doing it when Katie froze mid-step, her hand extended toward the gauze supplies, her eyes tracking the motion without meaning to. Their eyes locked. 1 second. That was all it took. 1 second for him to turn, to see her seeing him, to register the moment his theft transferred from private to witnessed. His smile came slowly, spreading across his face like oil on water. Not apologetic. Not alarmed. The smile of someone accustomed to walking away from everything he wanted to walk away from. "Nurse Morrison," he said. His voice was smooth, the kind of smooth that came from money and influence and knowing the system better than the system knew itself. "You're here early." "Inventory," she said. Her voice was even. Lower register, professional distance. The voice of someone who understood the shape of power and its boundaries. I didn't mean to interrupt. You didn't interrupt anything. He stepped past her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably had a name she wouldn't know. His shoulder didn't quite brush hers, but he made sure she felt the space where it almost did. Just checking on supplies. Patient advocate, you know. Make sure everything's in order. He left before she could respond. The cabinet door swung closed behind him with a pneumatic hiss, the sound of air escaping, the sound of something sealed. Katie stood alone in the supply room for exactly 3 seconds before her hands moved again, reaching for gauze, sorting through the organized chaos like the moment had never interrupted anything. But it had. She knew it. He knew she knew it. And he was smiling about it. 30 minutes later, standing at the nurse's station with her hands wrapped around a coffee that had gone lukewarm, Katie heard the incoming page. The ICU was calm, the way ICUs got at 0245, monitors beeping their steady hymns, ventilators wheeling their mechanical breath, and somewhere in the distance, the night shift crew moving through their rounds like ghosts in scrubs. The intercom crackled. Not a request. A command. Incoming trauma. Incoming trauma. ETA for minutes. General Marcus Hale, catastrophic chest injuries from training accident. Preparation for Level 1 trauma activation. All ICU personnel stand by. The words went through her like current. Not electricity. Something colder than that. Something like recognition. Her hands went still. The coffee cup hung suspended between the counter and her mouth, forgotten. Around her, the ICU shifted into gear, nurses moving faster, doctors converging, the orchestrated motion of a hospital preparing to receive the kind of injury that required everyone to be exactly where they needed to be exactly when they needed to be there. General Marcus Hale. She knew that name. She would know that name in a coma. She would know that name in a house fire with the smoke so thick she couldn't see her own hands. General Marcus Hale had signed her discharge papers 5 years ago, his signature black and authoritative at the bottom of a page that had ended her military career with 17 lines of carefully worded justification. She'd been Major Catherine Morrison then. She'd been somebody. Katie, you've got the primary patient, Dr. Sarah Chen, the night attending, called from across the ICU. She was already moving toward the trauma bay, her voice pitched to carry without shouting. Get your crash cart. You're on fluids and monitor. Katie set down her coffee. The cup made a small sound when it hit the counter, a click of ceramic against formica that seemed to echo through the entire floor. Her hands weren't shaking. That was the first thing she noticed about herself, that her hands weren't shaking. That her breathing was steady. That the part of her brain that had learned to survive shrapnel and sandstorms and the weight of dying soldiers was already calculating angles, preparing, shifting into the muscle memory that had kept her alive in Helmand Province. She was moving before her mind caught up with the motion. Push the crash cart. Check the 4 supplies. Verify the medications. Run through the protocol that had been taught to her twice, once in civilian nursing school and once in a field hospital where precision had meant the difference between bringing someone home and zipping a body bag. The trauma bay doors opened 90 seconds before the first ambulance siren wailed into the Jacksonville night. Katie wheeled her cart into position, her eyes forward, her movements automatic. Around her, the team assembled like pieces of a machine that had been built for exactly this moment, for exactly this emergency, for exactly this patient who was about to bring her past crashing through the present like a helicopter landing on a rooftop. The stretcher came through the doors with velocity, the paramedics calling vitals over the chaos, the trauma team moving in synchronized violence toward the unconscious man on the gurney. Even without the uniform, even without context, Katie would have recognized him. The bearing. The way, even unconscious, even bleeding, even broken, he looked like the kind of man who gave orders and watched them carried out. General Marcus Hale looked like her court-martial. She didn't move toward him. Not yet. The protocol was clear, the hierarchy was firm, and Katie Morrison understood hierarchy better than anyone in the trauma bay. She stood back, hands ready, waiting for her assignment, waiting for the moment when she would touch this man again without him knowing she'd already touched his signature to her destruction. Dr. Ashford appeared in the trauma bay exactly when the chaos reached its crescendo. He moved with the authority of someone who owned the space, and perhaps in some sense he did. Katie watched him take in the scene, the patient, the injuries, the way everything had shifted into crisis mode, and when his eyes found her across the room, he was smiling again. That same smile from the supply room. The smile of someone who understood that he had leverage, that he had secrets, that in the next few days, when this general was either dead or recovering in Katie's care, Ashford could weaponize the fact that she'd seen him steal medication intended for suffering patients. She met his gaze without flinching. Held it. Waited. The doors to the trauma bay slammed open as the code blue alarm started its wail, and everything else fell away. The code blue alarm screamed through Oak Creek Memorial like artillery fire, and Katie's body moved before her mind caught up. Muscle memory. 2 tours through Helmand Province had taught her that hesitation killed people. She was moving toward the trauma bay when the overhead speaker crackled to life, and her name came through distorted and cruel. Nurse Kitty to the pit. Nurse Kitty to the pit. The words hung in the fluorescent-lit corridor like smoke. She didn't break stride. Didn't flinch. But she felt it, the weight of 20 pairs of eyes turning toward her at the nurse's station, the quick exchange of glances, the barely suppressed smirks. Dr. Ashford stood at the center, phone still pressed to his ear, watching her with the satisfied smile of a man who'd just landed a punch. The nickname wasn't random. It was calculated. Diminishing. The kind of thing that turned a major with 13 years of combat medicine into something small, something laughable. Something that could be dismissed. Katie kept her chin level and continued walking. The code blue could be the general. It could be anyone. But her hands knew already. Her body recognized the rhythm of crisis the way a soldier recognizes incoming fire. She'd pushed through worse than one man's cruelty. She'd pushed through worse than being alive at all. The ER team was already assembling when she arrived. The general lay on the trauma stretcher, his chest heaving, his oxygen saturation climbing and falling like a stock market in free fall. 86. 79. 82. His surgeon wasn't in the room. Neither was Ashford. What's his status? Katie asked, already moving to the monitors. Post-op day 3, complications, someone said, a resident whose name she hadn't learned yet. Possible pneumothorax. We're waiting for the chief. Katie's jaw tightened. She could see it in the patient's presentation, the shallow breathing pattern, the way his body was compensating, the subtle distension in his neck that most people missed unless they'd been trained to see it in field hospitals where a chest tube and a prayer was all you had. Where's Dr. Ashford? The resident asked. Emergency call, another nurse said. He said to hold and monitor until he gets here. Katie looked at the general's face. Recognition flickered there, confusion, pain, the slow understanding that something was wrong. His eyes moved across the room, scanning, and for one fraction of a second they locked with hers. She saw the question in them. The plea without words. She didn't hesitate. The needle was in her hand before she'd made the conscious decision to reach for it. 14-gauge angiocath. She'd performed this procedure in tents with mortar rounds landing close enough to shake the 4 stands. She'd done it in the dark. She'd done it on soldiers who wouldn't survive the next hour regardless. She moved with the kind of fluid precision that came from having already survived the worst. The general's breath caught as she prepped the site. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her hands were steady as surgical laser beams. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a pressure valve releasing in a submarine. O2 saturation climbed. 84. 90. 93. Stable. What are you doing? The resident asked, voice climbing toward panic. Tension pneumothorax, Katie said quietly. He needed decompression 3 minutes ago. The monitor settled into a steady rhythm. The general's breathing deepened. His eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, something shifted in them. Not recognition exactly, but understanding. The understanding that whoever this woman was, she'd just given him another day. Katie stepped back, removed her gloves. The snap of latex sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. "We need to notify Dr. Ashford," the resident said. "Already done." Katie's voice came out flat, even. "He'll want a chest X-ray and CT to confirm the placement. Call radiology." But that wasn't the worst part. 20 minutes later, after the general was stabilized and the resident was sheepishly radioing the confirmation, Ashford appeared in the trauma bay doorway. His face cycled through emotions like a faulty light switch: surprise, recognition, then something colder. Calculation. He'd seen her perform the procedure. He'd seen her skill. And he'd immediately understood that he couldn't let that stand. Katie was restocking the supply closet on the second floor when he found her. The shelves were half empty, boxes of gauze and wrapped instruments arranged with military precision. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, but she didn't turn around. She continued organizing, her movements deliberate and methodical. Ashford stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind him. The fluorescent light overhead hummed its mechanical song. The air smelled of antiseptic and coffee, his coffee, the expensive kind he got from the private cafe on the first floor. "That was an interesting move," he said, his voice low enough that no one outside the small space would hear. "Taking charge of a code without authorization. Performing procedures you're not cleared for. Very risky for someone on probation." Katie continued arranging supplies. One box of 4x4 gauze. Another. Her hands didn't shake. Not even a tremor. Probationary employees who make waves rarely survive their reviews, he continued, stepping closer. Close enough that she could feel the presence of him like a pressure change in the air. "You seem like someone with secrets, Katie. Someone who can't afford investigations. Someone who might have things in her background that wouldn't hold up to scrutiny." He was fishing. Searching for leverage. Katie finally turned, and her eyes met his with the kind of flat composure that comes from having already lost everything once. "I understand," she said. "Do you?" He smiled. It was the smile of a man accustomed to winning. "Because from where I'm standing, you've got maybe 48 hours before I send a report to hospital administration detailing your unauthorized medical interventions, your questionable decision-making patterns, and your apparent inability to follow chain of command. I've already documented this afternoon's incident." Katie felt something inside her want to break. Not from fear. From the sheer grinding weight of injustice. From the knowledge that this man had stolen medication from the pharmacy, had watched her discover his crime, and was now weaponizing her courage against her. She wiped away the single tear that escaped, the only concession to the pressure building in her chest, and met his eyes again. "Cruelty always costs more than the person paying realizes," she said quietly. There was no anger in her voice. No threat. Just a statement of fact. The kind of thing someone says when they've already accepted the consequences of telling the truth. Ashford's smile faltered for half a second. Then he straightened, turned, and left without another word, his movement sharp with irritation. The door swung closed behind him with a soft click. Katie stood alone in the supply closet, surrounded by the ordered rows of medical supplies, and permitted herself exactly 2 minutes of silence before returning to work. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, as the day shift wrapped up and the night crew arrived in the parking lot for evening handoff, Ashford made his announcement. Katie was standing beside her decade-old Honda Civic, still wearing her day shift scrubs, when his voice carried across the asphalt with the kind of volume that guaranteed an audience. "Morrison," he called out from near the main entrance, waiting until she turned. Waiting until every arriving nurse and orderly and clerk was watching. "You're permanently reassigned to nights. Effective immediately. Your performance during probation has been concerning. We need to see some improvement in your judgment." The words hung in the humid Jacksonville evening like humidity itself, impossible to escape, pressing down on everything. Katie watched her colleagues' faces shift. Some looked sympathetic. Most just looked away. Eyes fixed on phones. On shoes. On the ground. She could have defended herself. Could have explained about the tension pneumothorax, about the protocol that wasn't written but was understood in every field hospital and every trauma center, that you stop someone from dying if you can. Could have pointed out that the general was stable because of her intervention. Instead, she walked closer to Ashford, close enough that only he could hear her. "When do I start?" Her voice didn't shake. Not a tremor. Not even a whisper of doubt. "Tonight." "You're already late," he said, glancing at his watch with theatrical impatience. Katie nodded once. Didn't argue. Didn't plead. Just walked back inside Oak Creek Memorial with her spine straight and her hand steady. The humiliation settled into her bones like the old shrapnel embedded near her spine, something permanent she'd learned to carry without flinching. She changed into fresh scrubs and clocked in for the night shift at 1847. By 1900, she was assigned to the farthest wing from the ICU, her patient load deliberately heavy, for post-op surgical patients, 2 orthopedic recoveries, and 1 elderly man with complications from a hip replacement. The kind of load that kept you moving, kept you focused, kept you from having time to think about careers being dismantled one shift at a time. At 2100, she made the rounds and checked monitors, and from her station in the West Corridor she could see the ICU through the observation windows. The general was sleeping. His oxygen saturation was steady at 96%. His heart rate was stable. He'd survived the night. That was enough. That had to be enough, because the alternative was allowing a man to die from pride. Code Blue, ICU Room 7. The overhead page still echoing when Katie's feet hit the tile. General Marcus Hale thrashed on the bed, his body convulsing, oxygen saturation numbers dropping like a stone through water. 94. 88. 72. The night resident stood frozen 3 feet away, clipboard clutched against his chest, eyes wide as a startled animal. Katie moved. No hesitation. No permission requested first. "Tension pneumothorax," she said, already reaching for the emergency kit on the crash cart. Her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who diagnosed this exact condition while lying in a forward operating base north of San Juan Valley with incoming fire bracketing the perimeter. His breath sounds are absent on the left. JVD distended. Tracheal deviation. "Where's Dr. Ashford?" The charge nurse was already dialing. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the overhead page button. "I'm paging him now." Code Blue, trauma attending, ICU 7. Code Blue, trauma attending, ICU 7. No response. Static. Then nothing. Hale's blood pressure dropped to 68 systolic. The monitor beeped its mechanical panic, a sound like a trapped bird throwing itself against glass. Katie opened the needle decompression kit with the efficiency of someone who'd done this in a Humvee during a dust storm, her fingers finding the 14-gauge angiocath needle as if the equipment had memory built into her muscle tissue. "I need authorization," the resident said. His voice cracked on the second word. He was maybe 3 years out of medical school, still carrying the uncertainty that came with believing the hierarchy mattered more than the patient's oxygen saturation. "He's dying now. Authorization is a luxury." Katie positioned herself at Hale's chest, her hand steady as a surgical laser despite the violence happening under her fingertips. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. You either authorize me or step aside, but neither of us gets to stand here and watch him become a cadaver." The resident nodded. That was all the permission she needed. Katie inserted the needle with the precision that came from 3 tours in Helmand Province, from field thoracotomies performed with combat knives because the right instruments weren't available, from keeping people alive when the alternative was flag-draped boxes returning to Dover Air Force Base. The hiss came immediate and violent, air screaming out under pressure, the sound of a balloon deflating in fast forward. Hale's oxygen saturation climbed. 90. 92. 95. His thrashing subsided into something almost like breathing. "Get me a chest tube tray," Katie said to the charge nurse, who was still holding the phone as if it might ring with instructions that would absolve her of responsibility. "Large bore. And call respiratory for a portable X-ray. We need to confirm placement before we move him." The covering physician arrived 6 minutes later, Dr. Patricia Chen from the ED, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who'd seen enough critical patients to understand that panic was a luxury no one could afford. She took in the scene in a single sweep, the needle positioned correctly, Hale's vitals stabilizing, Katie at the bedside with her hands already prepared for the next procedure. "What do we have?" Chen asked, her voice clipped, efficient. Katie talked her through it with the authority of someone who'd anticipated every complication before the monitors displayed them. Tension pneumothorax secondary to blunt thoracic trauma. Needle decompression successful but temporary measure. Anticipating possible re-expansion pulmonary edema during rapid fluid resuscitation, so we'll need to titrate carefully. The left main stem appears partially compromised, his breath sounds are diminished even post-decompression, suggesting either a flail segment or underlying contusion. Chen glanced at her. Just a flicker of recognition that something was different about this probationary night nurse who spoke in terms usually reserved for trauma surgeons. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. Katie didn't answer it as one. Chest tube placement should prioritize the fifth intercostal space, anterior axillary line. To avoid the diaphragm, Katie continued, already setting up the sterile field. "His vitals are fragile. Positive pressure ventilation is going to be essential but risky given the pneumothorax, so we should position for the tube first, then secure his airway." Chen nodded and moved into position beside her. They worked in the rhythm of people who trained in the same system, spoken the same language of controlled chaos and methodical precision. No wasted motion. No redundant questions. Just two medical professionals understanding exactly what the next 60 seconds required. Katie assisted with the precision of someone whose hands had held lives together in places where there was no backup, where the next decision meant the difference between sinus rhythm and flatline, between survival and a body bag. The chest tube went in cleanly. Bright red blood drained into the collection chamber, not the flood of acute hemorrhage, but enough to suggest significant blunt force trauma to the thoracic cavity. Hale's oxygen saturation stabilized. His blood pressure climbed back toward something that resembled normal. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, no longer the frantic panic of a patient in extremis. By 0400 hours, General Marcus Hale was sedated in a proper ICU bed with a covered airway, bilateral chest tubes draining, and a trauma surgery consult scheduled for first light. Katie stood at the bedside, running through the post-resuscitation checklist with the methodical focus that came from knowing what happened when you skipped steps. Medication administration. Ventilator settings. Hemodynamic parameters. The small details that separated survival from catastrophic failure. That was when Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway. His hair was uncombed. His shirt was buttoned incorrectly, the top button aligned with the second buttonhole. He smelled faintly of alcohol, not the sharp reek of active intoxication, but the lingering ghost of a man who'd been drowning something in a bottle when he should have been answering pages. His eyes moved across the scene, the stabilized patient, the emergency equipment, the chart filled out in Katie's precise handwriting, and his jaw clenched. "Why wasn't I notified immediately?" he demanded. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to never being questioned, to having his instructions treated as commands from on high. The night resident started to explain, words tumbling out in apology and justification. Ashford cut him off with a gesture that was less a dismissal than a blade. "Get out of this room. Now." The resident fled. Dr. Chen lingered for a moment, watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what was happening in the space between these two people. Then she excused herself to handle the trauma surgery consult, leaving Katie and Ashford alone in the ICU room with only the soft beep of monitors and the mechanical wheeze of the ventilator. Ashford stepped closer. His eyes locked onto Katie's with the intensity of a man who'd just watched his leverage slip through his fingers. He'd expected her to fail. Anticipated that a probationary nurse relegated to night shift would freeze, would panic, would defer to whatever junior resident happened to be standing closest. Instead, she'd moved like someone trained in exactly this, in the precise choreography of controlled catastrophe. "You're out of your scope," he said quietly. "Dangerously. Needle decompression is physician-only procedure." Katie's hands continued their work, checking Hale's dressing, ensuring the chest tube remained properly positioned. Life-threatening emergency. Verbal authorization was obtained from the covering resident. The procedure was documented and executed within scope of critical care nursing practice under emergency circumstances. Her voice was steady. Professional. A recording of facts, nothing more. "We'll see what administration thinks about that." Ashford turned away, but his movements carried the frustrated fury of a man who'd just realized his opponent had anticipated every move he was planning to make. By morning, HR had indeed summoned Katie for a meeting about alleged medication discrepancies in her supply room access logs. The same medication Ashford had been stealing. The same supply room where their eyes had locked for one fatal second while he smiled and closed the cabinet door. But that wasn't what concerned Katie. What concerned her was the understanding that had crystallized during those 60 seconds with her hands on a general's chest, the realization that Dr. Ashford had just become dangerous in a completely different way. She'd saved his victim. She'd done it with authority and competence that couldn't be explained away by probationary status or night shift isolation. She'd stepped out of the role he'd constructed for her. And now he would escalate. The second day after the code blue, General Hale seized violently during morning rounds from unanticipated brain injury complications that no one had anticipated. Katie was changing linens in the next room when she heard the crash, a sound like furniture falling through concrete, the bed rails hammering against the wall. She ran in to find him convulsing, his body slamming against the mattress, chest tube pulling dangerously with each violent contraction. Without thinking, without the luxury of hesitation, Katie threw herself across his torso. She shielded the tube site with her own body, absorbing his flailing strikes like she'd absorbed shrapnel 5 years ago in Helmand Province. His elbow caught her jaw. His knee drove upward into her ribs where the old wound sat, where the metal fragment still nested near her spine like a second skeleton. She held on. Held him down. Protected the surgical site until the seizure passed, until his body went rigid and still, until the code team arrived with medications and restraints. When it was over, Katie stood with blood on her lip and a bruise forming across her cheekbone like a bruise forming across her entire career, one strike at a time. Dr. Ashford watched from the hallway, his face unreadable, his eyes calculating something darker than concern. That afternoon, he summoned her to his office. The door clicked shut behind her with the finality of a prison cell. "I've completed my investigation," Ashford said, sliding a folder across his desk with the precision of someone closing an argument. The fabricated logs were meticulous. Controlled medications dispensed under her credentials at times she wasn't on the floor, each entry dated, each amount documented, each one a lie he'd constructed with the same surgical care he applied to his theft. Katie looked at the records without touching them. "You have a choice," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of institutional power, the kind that doesn't need to raise itself. "Resign quietly today, I'll write a neutral reference, or face a formal investigation. Which means police. Criminal charges. Your probation ends either way." She thought of the single dog tag in her locker, the broken chain wrapped around it 3 times. The career she'd already lost once. The way General Marcus Hale had signed her discharge papers 5 years ago without meeting her eyes, his signature black as a coffin nail. "I'd choose my career over covering for you," Ashford said, leaning back in his chair like a man already assured of victory, "and I'm a surgeon. You're a probationary nurse with no witnesses and a history of, what? We don't even know, do we? No military service on your application. What are you hiding, Katie? What are you so desperate that you'd protect?" The silence stretched. Katie stood. Took one measured breath that tasted like blood and antiseptic and the bitter flavor of a second ending. "I'll have my resignation by end of shift," she said. Her voice came out steady as a heartbeat. Ashford smiled. He shouldn't have smiled. But he did, and in that moment, he believed he'd won. That evening, Katie stood alone in the hospital laundry room, folding her scrubs one final time with the same precision she'd once used on her dress uniform. The fabric was warm from the industrial dryer, still holding the memory of heat like her hand still held the memory of surgery. Each crease received the same attention, hospital corners, precise lines, the kind of discipline that came from years of preparation for things that mattered. The detergent smell was institutional and cold, nothing like the diesel and dust of FOB shank where she'd last folded fatigues before deployment. She pressed each fold with steady hands, watching the scrubs transform from shapeless cloth into neat stacks, the only order she had left to impose on anything. The final indignity of a career ended twice. She left the folded scrubs on the counter beside the laundry baskets and walked out of Oak Creek Memorial without looking back, without saying goodbye, without letting anyone see that the cost had been calculated and accepted and paid in full. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence in her apartment that night, the way the walls echoed with absence, the way her laptop sat unopened on the kitchen counter because there was no one left to update, no one to tell except the dog tag she pulled from her locker before leaving, its surface tarnished and cold against her palm. She held it under the apartment light. Read the letters and numbers one more time. Catherine Eleanor Morrison. Major. Special Forces. The identity she'd buried, the life she'd compartmentalized, the woman she'd agreed to erase in exchange for anonymity and fresh starts that never quite started fresh. She wrapped the broken chain around her fingers and made a choice that night, a choice that Dr. Ashford couldn't have predicted, that no one at Oak Creek Memorial could have anticipated, a choice that would cost her everything she'd rebuilt and give her back something she'd thought was lost forever. But the consequences of that choice were still hours away, still sleeping in a hospital room 3 floors below where she'd folded her last set of scrubs, still unaware of the phone call coming at 1400 the next afternoon. At precisely 1400 hours, the hospital's routine background check for a new federal contract flagged Katie's classified security clearance. The personnel director's assistant uploaded the flag into the system, a simple administrative task, the kind of work that changes everything without anyone realizing the walls are collapsing until the dust settles. The file populated on screen. Level 5 Department of Defense Security Clearance. Names redacted. Organizations redacted. Deployment locations redacted. The next page made the director's hands tremble. Surgical credentials from Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. Tactical Combat Casualty Care Instructor Certification. Combat Trauma Surgery Experience verified by Army Medical Command. A security clearance level that required authorized DOD personnel to view the unredacted portions, clearance she didn't have, clearance that meant the person sitting in their ICU folding scrubs had lived a life so classified that a hospital personnel director had no authority to know the details. The director reached for her phone and dialed Colonel Sarah Hale, whose contact information had just arrived in the same file marked urgent. "This is Colonel Sarah Hale," the voice answered. "I'm calling about the nurse who saved my father 2 nights ago." The director's throat tightened. That employee just resigned. Yesterday. Dr. Ashford said she was, what did you say? The director's voice shook as she began reading the file aloud, each sentence stripping away the persona of the quiet probationary nurse and revealing the architecture beneath, the training, the deployments, the call sign, the service record that made her absence impossible to explain away. Colonel Hale was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the weight of someone finally understanding why her father had been asking for his nurse every hour since consciousness returned. "That nurse who saved my father," Colonel Hale said carefully, "is Major Catherine Morrison. United States Army Special Forces." At 1,400 hours, the hospital's routine background check for a federal contract did what 5 years of silence never could. The system flagged a classified security clearance that shouldn't exist in a probationary nurse's file, and every administrator with access permissions began reading with trembling hands. The redactions alone told the story. Page after page of blacked-out sections, each one a mile marker of a life nobody at Oak Creek Memorial had been allowed to know existed. By 14:30, the personnel director was calling an emergency board meeting. By 1445, General Hale's daughter walked into that meeting with a single sentence that stopped every voice in the room cold. "That nurse who saved my father," she said, her eyes moving across the table with the same command presence her father carried. "That's Major Catherine Morrison." The personnel director's pen fell to the desk. "I'm sorry, what?" "My father called me this morning from his recovery bed. He asked why a major in Special Forces was working night shift as a probationary employee. He said he recognized her the moment she performed the needle decompression, but he wanted to know why she'd hidden it. So I called the Pentagon. It took 3 phone calls, but they confirmed it. That nurse is Major Catherine Morrison, decorated combat medic, Helmand Province, 2019 through 2023. The room didn't just go silent. The room forgot how to breathe. One administrator, the director of clinical operations, pulled up the redacted file on the conference table screen and began scrolling, his jaw tightening with each blacked-out section. 18 pages. 19. 20. Each redaction getting thicker, darker, more absolute. The kind of redaction that meant Pentagon-level security protocols, that meant classified operations, that meant a life lived in contexts that civilian hospitals weren't cleared to understand. "There's a bronze star here," someone whispered. "Behind the redaction, you can see part of the citation." "Silver star," corrected the general's daughter quietly. "My father confirmed that. He also mentioned 2 purple hearts. One from an IED. One from," she paused, and her voice dropped even lower, "from saving his life in 2021. By 1630, the SEAL team leader arrived, Commander James Price, who'd served with Katie in Kandahar. He walked into the board meeting carrying a USB drive and didn't waste time with introductions. 14 lives saved under direct enemy fire," he said, inserting the drive into the conference laptop. "Including mine. Play this." The video testimony came through crisp and professional. Price in dress whites, his voice steady as a laser, each sentence a piece of evidence that disassembled the last shred of doubt. "Major Morrison performed field thoracotomy with a combat knife in a Taliban ambush because our surgeon was pinned down. She learned that procedure from watching YouTube videos and reading a medical journal. She did it in the dark. With one flashlight. 14 lives, including the commanding officer she'd been court-martialed by 5 years earlier. She didn't know it was him until his eyes opened." The silence after the video ended tasted like steel. That evening, Dr. Richard Ashford did something catastrophically stupid. He called WJX News 4's evening broadcast and requested immediate airtime, and Beth Marino, who loved a story with teeth, gave it to him live at 1900 hours. He sat under bright studio lights wearing his white coat, his silver wedding band catching the reflection as he gesticulated with what he thought was concern. His voice moved through the narrative like honey laced with arsenic. "The public deserves to know," he said, leaning forward, "that Oak Creek Memorial employed an unstable veteran who falsified her credentials. This woman had unsupervised access to vulnerable patients, to controlled medications, with zero proper oversight. I attempted to address these issues through institutional channels, but I was ignored." Beth nodded, professional and hungry. "Dr. Ashford, we've received several calls about this situation." "Let me," her earpiece crackled. Her hand rose. Her eye shifted to something beyond the camera. "We have a caller. Live from U.S. Special Operations Command." "Sir, go ahead." The voice came through the phone line like a tank idling in a garage. "Granite and Command. This is Lieutenant General Robert Chen, United States Special Operations Command. Did Dr. Ashford just say he considered Major Catherine Morrison unstable?" Ashford's face froze. The color drained like someone had opened a valve. "Major Morrison," the general continued, his voice steady and public and permanent, "is one of the most decorated combat medical officers in the recent force. She saved 14 lives under direct enemy fire in Helmand Province. She performed battlefield surgery that is currently taught at the Special Forces Medical Sergeant's course at Fort Bragg. She holds a Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts." Dr. Ashford, do you realize you just slandered a decorated combat officer on live television? The employment file didn't. Ashford's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Why did she resign yesterday? Beth pressed, and the question hung in the air like a blade suspended above her neck. I don't have information about that. According to statements we've received, Beth continued, and Ashford's eyes went wide because he suddenly understood that this was no longer a sympathetic platform. Dr. Ashford, were you aware that Major Morrison saved General Marcus Hale's life 72 hours ago with a needle decompression? The same general you claim she endangered. The general's voice came back, ice-cold and public record. I'm also informed that Dr. Ashford has been under investigation for controlled substance diversion for 6 months. That Major Morrison witnessed this theft and reported it to hospital administration. That when she did, she was subjected to retaliation, reassignment, and finally, when she continued to be a problem, coerced into resignation through fabricated criminal allegations. Would Dr. Ashford care to address why his victim is now the subject of his public slander? The interview went viral in 42 minutes. By 2,100 hours, it had been shared 847,000 times. By midnight, the FBI had knocked on Oak Creek Memorial's administrative offices with warrants and subpoenas. By 0600 the next morning, Dr. Richard Ashford's medical license was suspended pending investigation, his office was sealed, and every major news outlet in Florida was running the headline, "Corrupt Surgeons Cover-Up Exposed by Decorated War Hero." Ashford watched his career incinerate across every screen, every feed, every social platform, the entire internet bearing witness to his collapse. His phone didn't stop ringing. His wife had already moved to her parents' house. His malpractice insurance was cancelling. By week's end, his medical license was permanently revoked, and the only job he could find was night security at the hospital that had once trembled when he walked past. 6 months later, Katie Morrison pushed through the front doors of Oak Creek Memorial wearing her rank insignia on the white coat of the Director of Emergency Medicine. The job had been offered to her by the hospital board with an apology so profound it almost broke her composure. Almost. She'd accepted it in the same measured tone she used for everything. I'll need to review the incident protocols first. Her office overlooked the ICU. On the desk, in a shadow box made from reclaimed aircraft aluminum, sat the single dog tag on the broken chain, her original chain, the one she'd kept in her locker, the one that should never have existed. Next to it, framed in military-grade acrylic, was her Silver Star citation. Both of them finally where they belonged. The air in the office smelled like fresh paint and the sharp copper scent of hope. That first night shift, she reviewed patient charts when she heard the security cart wheels squeaking down the corridor outside her door. The rhythm was distinctive: pause, wheel, the gait of someone without confidence. Dr. Richard Ashford pushed the trash bin past her office, and for one moment his eyes collided with hers. His uniform was ill-fitting. His posture was collapsed. He looked at her the way people look at something they've destroyed and can never rebuild. Katie took one measured breath. Said nothing. Met his gaze with the quiet authority of someone who'd chosen mercy over vengeance, and watched him move on down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the fluorescent-lit darkness of a career that would never exist again. Downstairs in the ICU recovery room, General Marcus Hale stood by the window in dress Army PT uniform, leaning on a carbon fiber cane. When Katie entered for the evening check, he turned, saw her rank insignia, and slowly, painfully, his injury still fresh, lowered himself to one knee on the tiled floor. "Major Morrison," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "I owed you this 5 years ago. I was wrong about that mission report. I was wrong about you. You saved my life, and I—" "General, please stand up," Katie said quietly, moving to help him. But he stayed down for one more moment, his eyes carrying the weight of 5 years of guilt and 2 days of understanding. "You had every reason to let me die," he continued, "and you saved me anyway. That's who you are." Katie helped him to his feet, her hand steady, her composure unbroken. Later, walking through the parking lot where Ashford had once humiliated her under the sodium lights, she passed him emptying trash bins. He didn't look up. She paused, just for a moment, and said quietly, only for him to hear, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." She drove home under the Jacksonville night sky, the dog tag finally resting where it belonged, the weight of vindication feeling strangely like the weight of forgiveness, both heavier and lighter than she'd ever imagined. If you believe in standing up for what's right, even when the world tells you to stay silent, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments, would you have saved him, or walked away?